from Ravenswood, West Virginia here in Jackson County. While here, see places such as Ravenswood, Kenna, and Ripley. We'll also speak with Nancy Burford, Director of the Washington Lands Museum, Rob Benson, Ravenswood business owner and local historian, and Mike Rubin, Director of the Ripley Convention and Visitors Bureau, and they'll all give us a detailed account of some of Jackson County's history and culture.
This area that we call Jackson County now today was really a great land for Indians. We had Indians on both sides of the river, mostly Shawnee. The Indians found that this area had such a dense growth of trees that it made for absolutely wonderful hunting grounds. Later on, when white men came into the region, things changed, and this area became more of a battleground. And we can see that from the relics that have been collected by those who've scavenged along the riverbanks from Belleville down to Millwood, and they have found everything from spear points, arrowheads, and lots of implements that attest to the fact that there was bloodshed and fighting here in this area. One of the first French explorers who came down the Ohio River was a man named La Salle. He was convinced by some Indians up in Montreal that he could travel downriver from Montreal and make it all the way to the ocean. He decided he would set out down the river with that goal in mind. He came by canoe, of course, and came down the Allegheny, got into the Monongahela, then into the Ohio. He even passed Ravenswood and went on downriver, made it to the Ohio Falls, what we call today Louisville, Kentucky. There, the Ohio Falls were such an intimidating prospect for the Indians that were with him. They got scared and ran off. Well, without Indians to help, he couldn't continue his journey. He had to turn around and go back to Montreal. When he got to Montreal, though, he said, all the land that I have gone by is now French. Well, it took a while, but the word got around, and the English said, whoa, King James gave us that land back in 1629, and that's our land. We own from one coast to the other. Well, the French weren't satisfied. They decided then to send another man. And Celeron went down river. He again came down the path, came down the Ohio River, and every time he came to a little stream that emptied into the Ohio, he stopped and he put down a little plaque that said that this land belongs to the French. Got back in the canoe, went on down, did the same thing each time, and claiming all the land then for the French. We know that he did that because one of the plaques was found in Point Pleasant, and later one was found in Louisville. So the man did make the claim, but that didn't hold true. The white men who came into this region caused a lot of conflict. They were wanting to look at the area, and of course the Indians said, this is our land, we've lived here, and you're trespassing. So there was a lot of fighting that went on. And that led to even more conflict, and we know that there were battles before even the French and Indian War in places like Point Pleasant because of the conflicts that there were. But there was one final expedition of this area that kind of set up what was to come for this area totally, and that was one that was initiated by the Ohio Land Company. The Ohio Land Company wasn't in Ohio. It was a group of Maryland and Virginia planters. They were interested in settling this big wilderness that existed here on the edge of the Ohio River. They sent a man into the region, Gist. He came into the region and he surveyed, he examined, he explored, he looked at the area so that he could go back and report on the probability that this would be good land for settlement. And sure enough, word of this great region spread in Washington, and there was a kind of a land fever that developed, so much so that even George Washington heard about it, and Washington said, that really sounds promising. I think I want in on that. He decided he would make an expedition, so he came to Fort Pitt, we call Pittsburgh today, came to Fort Pitt and got 2 canoes. One canoe was outfitted with himself and Crawford, who was his surveyor, a doctor, an interpreter, and a young boy. The other was filled with friendly Indians. So those 2 canoes started a journey down the Ohio. And the fortunate thing is that they kept a record, they kept a diary of all that they looked at, all they explored, all they saw. He was so impressed with all that he saw along the banks of the Ohio. He traveled even down here to Ravenswood. We have a record that he passed us late in October. He notes the great bend in the river that we're so proud of right here. He stops in areas like Millwood. He goes on downriver, goes to Point Pleasant, decides that he'll go up the Kanawha River, starts the Kanawha River, goes a short distance, decides to turn around. He turns around, comes back to Point Pleasant, heads north again on the Ohio River. He stopped down at Millwood. He camped. He spent the night. He and Crawford then walked this land that we call Washington's Western Lands and explored for himself all that was here. He went back to Washington with his thoughts of settlement of this region. And he had great dreams. He wanted to settle this land. He had plans. He sent people in with materials to build. He encouraged building and settlement. Before he died, he had such great dreams, but unfortunately he died before he saw the settlement of the region. His land went to his heirs, so he didn't have any real say in how it was developed, even though he really wanted that to be the case. But after he had come through here, not as a result of his direct influence, but because people were coming over the mountains, coming down the river, this area began to be prime territory for those who were looking for a place to settle. And sure enough, 3 fellows came in the late 1700s and established then a homestead here. And from that, we had more people coming in. The Fitzhughs developed the area. The lots were laid out, town was laid out and established in 1852. We had Ravenswood then established as a town.
Ravenswood has been a business community even longer than people would actually think. In the early 1830s, Bartholomew Fleming started the first ferry boat here at Ravenswood, which brought in outside agriculture to the docks, which helped business to grow here. Though he wasn't actually had state license until the late 1830s, he did this up in him and his family actually ran a ferry boat here into the 1870s, 1880s. The next type of business probably here would have been Henry Fitzhugh, who built a sawmill and some kind of a little mill, other mills not described exactly what it was, but said he had 2 businesses along Sand Creek. The next places that come in here would probably been the boat docks coming in and bringing more boaters in, which led to the establishment of a huge hotel on the river down here it was called the Ravenswood House. And Duncan Hines, the travel authority at the time, listed it as a 4-star stopping point, which brought more people in. Located along the banks of the river, it was easily accessible and most generally, according to details, was filled up all the time. The Civil War came and the economy slowed down a little bit, but at the close of the Civil War, in the 1870s, Ephraim Wells came to town, and he's actually in town, but he actually moved his business to town and built what was called a flour mill, again, which was used by the local farmers that helped, the agricultural business and helped the business of the town. This was the main goal at that time, was the agriculture. I mean, at that time, the manufacturing base had slowed down a little bit and stayed that way until like 1886 when the railroad came to town, and that was a bustling time for the city. It was expanding. It was busting at the seams, basically. It just couldn't have enough housing for the people who came to town. There was a lot of, not necessarily manufacture, but you had what they called hoops makers, which was barrel makers. They had cigar stores, several different types of small, more a broom factory, things like that. And that was what Ravenswood was up until after the World War I, and then it went into a slow time, which was then followed by the manufacturing phase coming back when a porcelain factory in 1922 opened just north of town, and it would later progress into what would become the Ravenswood pottery, which was stayed in business till the 1960s. At that time also there was a marble factory in town, which went north of town also, that hired several of the local people. And these were the two main manufacturing facilities until in the early 1950s, the rumor started flying that there was another major business planning to open south of town. And in 1955, it was let known to the public that this was going to be a Kaiser aluminum plant with approximately 2,000 employees to start out with. And then even before it opened its doors, it had doubled in size and hired another 500 or 600 people too, so which gave us a big dynamic boost at that time. When Kaiser Aluminum came to town, it was an overnight boom for the community. A town of 1,900 people all of a sudden became a town of 4,000 with nowhere for people to stay. Some of the local people was working at the plant, coal miners from the southern part of West Virginia, the northern part of West Virginia. Then you had different types of people coming from Chalmette, Louisiana, Spokane, Washington, Oakland, California, and even some coming from the plants over in Africa. So it was a diverse group of people that gathered here, and it caused problems from the fact that, one, we didn't have enough schools. The education system had to change overnight because pre-Kaiser, basically, a lot of people didn't talk about college. But now with the influx of the people from the bigger cities, they wanted classes that would prepare children for college. And this was a thing that had to be instituted into the school system. Henry Kaiser himself built the local elementary in town, so it would give him a threshold to start with. And then even at the grocery stores, things like that, we had to change our fares there because a lot of people had things that they liked to eat that we hadn't even heard of locally. And so the merchants had to address that. At that time, we had mostly local merchants who weren't really aware of the outside trends and activities, so they had to brush up on their business too, and over time, some of these businesses would give way to chain stores, which would know more about what they needed and things like that. The growth of the city at that time, Ravenswood was just basically from Sycamore Street south, but North Ravenswood was just more or less an agricultural area. But with the coming of the people that needed housing quickly, North Ravenswood, which would eventually become part of the city of Ravenswood, saw houses go up, 5 or 10 of them started a week until they could actually get under control. What we needed, motels weren't around here, so we didn't have any place for the guys to stay. So the things had to happen quickly, and it did almost overnight. A place called Colonial Manor opened up, which was a bunch of places for them to rent or buy, so they could get in, and they were built within a few months' time to give places for the workers who eventually wanted to bring their families to town and give time for the houses to be built. And it was a madhouse for a while, but over time people learned the others' trades and activities. The merchants become more aware. The school systems adapted. The people adapted and grow into where we're at today with Ravenswood being a more diverse growth of population than what we had back in the 1950s when Henry Kaiser first came to town.
We always hear of the Civil War as being blue versus gray, and I think Jackson County is, for the most part, where blue met gray, because if you look to the north, the community of Parkersburg was predominantly for the Union forces. If you look to the south, the community of Charleston was primarily for the Confederacy. But right in the middle, you have Jackson County, where it was literally brother against brother, cousin against cousin for 4 years and beyond. The most interesting incident that happened in Jackson County during the Civil War was the Battle of Buffington Island. And this was a Confederate raid that started in Kentucky under John Hunt Morgan. And he took his cavalry forces from Kentucky into Indiana, into Ohio, was just trying to raise as much havoc as he could. He was stealing supplies, he was burning buildings, he was stealing horses, and finally the Union forces had enough of John Hunt Morgan and began to close in on him. And he was feeling the heat. So he was moving up the Ohio Valley in Meigs County, Ohio, directly across the river from Jackson County, and his idea was to move back into Virginia. But in the meantime, after his raid had started, West Virginia went from being Virginia to becoming West Virginia. The state of West Virginia was 1 month old almost to the day when John Hunt Morgan arrived at Buffington Island. His idea was to get away from the Union forces by crossing the Ohio River, and there was a ford in the river at Buffington Island where under normal circumstances in the summer you could literally walk across the Ohio River at that ford. But due to heavy rain in the area, he was unable to walk across the river, so it delayed his cause by about a day. And that was unfortunate because the Union forces continued to move in, and in the meantime, the Union sent 3 federal gunboats down the river to make matters even more difficult for Morgan's men. So at that time, there were 52 Confederate men who were killed. There were 100 Confederates who were injured, and more significantly, there were 750 Confederate soldiers who were captured. And most of this action took place on the Ohio side of the river, but there were men who were actually killed in the river, some who drowned in the river, and some who escaped to Jackson County and went on and made their way back to Virginia to escape the Union forces. One of the interesting incidents that happened in the Ripley area during the Civil War was a raiding party from the Confederate Home Guard known as the Moccasin Rangers. And they came over from the central part of the state and rampaged through the town and went on supplies and gathered up all that they could get because the Union supporters were out of town at the time. And the Union leader didn't want any trouble while he was gone, so he locked all of the guns of the town in the county jail. So the Confederacy came into town and basically had no one there to contest them. And Daniel Dusky and the Moccasin Rangers went to the local post office and wanted in. And the postmaster refused to unlock the post office. Well, Mr. Dusky said, well, you don't have to unlock that door. I've got a key that will unlock any door. And he proceeded to pick up his boot and kick in the door and proceeded to steal and rampage through the mail and took what he wanted, and then they went on their way. But the Union forces later caught up with them, and this was a federal offense to break into a U.S. post office. So they captured him, they had a trial, and he was put in jail and was going to be in jail for 4 years. And the Confederacy didn't want anything to do with that. So they worked out a prison exchange for Mr. Dusky and the Moccasin Rangers in exchange for Union prisoners. And in order to get permission to do this, the prison exchange message had to go to the desk of President Abraham Lincoln, and he signed that permission and allowed Mr. Dusky to go back to the Confederate side. As the population in the western part of the state began to increase in the 1820s, 1830s, the people who lived in this area petitioned the General Assembly of Virginia to form a new county. And the Virginia Assembly agreed, and they took part of Kanawha County from the south, Wood County from the north, and Mason County from the west, and they said, okay, you can form your own county. That's the good news. The bad news is they weren't going to provide any money to provide a courthouse, a jail, or it was up to the county to provide all of the money. And that led to a couple of major debates because the people who lived along the Ohio River desperately wanted the county seat to be located along the river. That's where the majority of the population was based. And the people who lived in the central and southern parts of the county said, well, that's too far for us to go because they live basically close to Charleston or close to Point Pleasant, and they didn't want to go 30 or 40 miles to go to the courthouse. So that led to a major debate. And that they couldn't settle the debate among the people in the county. So the Virginia General Assembly appointed 5 commissioners from existing counties to come in and settle this dispute. And the commissioners came in 1831, and they surveyed the situation, and they were listening to the different reasons why the county seat should be located in Ravenswood, or while it should be located in the central part of the county. Well, the biggest problem was the money aspect of it. The new county had no money to build a courthouse or to build a jail. So a man by the name of Jacob Starcher, he had the solution to the problem, and he was successful in convincing this independent commission to locate the courthouse in the center of the county. He was a large landowner in the area. He had more than 400 acres here in the center of the county. And what he proposed was he was going to donate 8 acres of land right in the center of the county for the county seat. And his idea was to give 2 acres for the courthouse and the jail, and that's still where they're located today. And the surrounding 6 acres he was going to give to the county, and they could sell off those lots and raise money to finance the courthouse and the jail. And that was successful in convincing this independent commission to locate the courthouse, the county seat here in Ripley. This area was going to be known as Jackson Courthouse, and the center of the community was the courthouse. And that was around 1832. Well, in 1830, this area was served, we didn't have a church in the community, it was served by a circuit-riding Methodist minister. And he was on the Little Kanawha Circuit, and this was a rather large area between the Kanawha River and the Little Kanawha River. So he had to serve more than a 100-mile stretch of land, and he would go around from community to community, from cabin to cabin, and meet the spiritual needs of the people in the area. Well, the minister that served this area was a young man by the name of Harry Ripley. And Harry, as the story goes, Harry fell in love with a local lady and was going to marry her. And he was back in the community to propose to his bride. And as the story goes, he was on his way and he had his marriage certificate in his coat pocket. And an accident happened, no one was there, so we don't really know what happened. But Harry Ripley, a young Harry Ripley, drowned in Mill Creek on his way to propose to his bride. Well, he left such an impression on the people of this young community that here in 1832, 2 years after his death, they decided that they would change the name from Jackson Courthouse to Ripley and name the community after him. Unfortunately, that message apparently did not get to the postal officials. So for more than 50 years, the town was known as Ripley, but the post office was known as Jackson Courthouse. So you received your mail to Jackson Courthouse if you lived in Ripley. And after more than 50 years, they decided to change the name of the post office. But they still didn't change the name to Ripley. They shortened the name from Jackson Courthouse to Jackson. And finally, 4 years later, in 1897, the post office and the community came under the common name of Ripley. And they shared that name from 1897 on. This came from a local newspaper dated in 1899, and it quotes a woman who lived in the area. Her name was May Parsons. And she said, "In the year 1830, when the valley of this beautiful stream was still an unbroken forest, Harry Ripley, a young Methodist preacher, in an effort to ford the stream on horseback 2 miles above town, was drowned. He had his license to marry a lovely and devoted woman. This death, so sad, made such a profound impression upon the people of the village that they named the place in honor of Ripley. The body was recovered and the fourth buried in the cemetery." There was a great debate in the state of West Virginia on what to do about public hangings. That was how you handled criminals in the day. And there was a great deal of debate about that, and people did not like the idea that you had these public hangings. So there was already a controversy. And it reached a peak in November and December of 1897 when you had a treacherous murder, a tragic murder, that took place in the Fairplain community. And there was a young man by the name of John Morgan, and for reasons that we're really still not sure about. He had went to this house. He was familiar with the family. He had stayed with them in the past, and in that following morning he murdered two of the children and the widow mother, and was trying to murder a third child, and the third child managed to get away and escaped to an adjacent farm and got help. But the murder of John Morgan was a prime example of swift justice on the state of West Virginia at the time, because the murder took place in November of 1897. So he committed the murder, he was captured, he escaped from jail, he was apprehended, they had the trial, they had the hanging, and he was buried. And all of this happened in a little more than a month. And in today's standards, that would last several years by the time you had all of the appeals and the court proceedings. But this was swift justice. Ripley has never been a large industrial center. There was a grist mill in the area. There was a tannery in the area. There was a lot of farming that took place in the area, limited amount of oil and gas work that went on in the area. But Ripley has always been known for its retail establishments. There's Vale Furniture is located on the corner, the main corner here in Ripley, and it was established in 1844 by Isaiah Vale, and it is the oldest family-operated furniture store in America. And Isaiah Vale started out, he ran a funeral business, and he built furniture. So he combined the two businesses into one, and that became Vale Furniture. One of the other interesting enterprises that's here in town is the Mill Creek Trading Company. And they make primitive decor items for sale, and they also manufacture them. But it is located in the old 1888 Circuit Train Depot, and it still works out of the old train depot that connected Ripley with the Ohio Valley back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And one of the really interesting retail individuals of the area was a man by the name of O.J. Morrison. And O.J. Morrison got his start in the community of Kenna back in the late 1800s, and soon bought out his brother-in-law partner and moved his store into Ripley. And from Ripley he operated the store for about 10 years, and then he moved to Spencer, and then he moved to Charleston. And before O.J. Morrison was finished, he had built a chain of 15 stores across West Virginia. They say he was the Walmart of the day in West Virginia. And those stores lasted, they were in their prime in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They started to decline in the 70s, 80s, and the last store went out of business in the 1990s. Transportation has always been good to the Ripley community. In the 1930s and 40s, you had the development of Route 21, which was a major north-south route that went from Cleveland to Florida. And you had a major east-west route in Route 33. And Route 33 and Route 21 met right in the heart of Ripley. So the Ripley community in the pre-interstate days still had a number of gasoline stations, restaurants, hotels, because this was a major transportation point that connected Route 21 and Route 33. Whereas Route 21 had been a major north-south route in the early days, in the 60s and 70s, you had Interstate 77 move through the area. And Interstate 77, just like Route 21 had been several decades earlier, Interstate 77 was very good to the Ripley community. You have two exits located at each end of town. You have the Fairplain Ripley exit on the south end of town, and you have the Ripley exit, the West Ripley exit on that end of town. And if you look at the development that's happened in Ripley over the past 20, 30 years, it has been centered around those two exits, with several restaurants, gasoline stations, and hotels that have, as well as shopping areas that have moved into those areas of the community. West Virginia is served by 17 covered bridges. There are only 17 remaining, and 2 of those 17 are located in Jackson County. The Sarvis Fork covered bridge is still used by transportation today, and it's located in the Sandyville community just off of Route 21. It's not on Route 21, but you can see it from there. The other covered bridge is the Stats Mill covered bridge, and it was originally located in the community of Stats Mill, but due to the Mill Creek watershed program, it was going to be underwater. So they wanted to preserve the covered bridge, so it was very wise. They moved the covered bridge to Cedar Lakes, and they were able to preserve the structure for everyone to see and enjoy today. The Ripley community is known for its celebrations. It is said to have the largest small-town 4th of July celebration in America. And we know that it's the largest small-town 4th of July celebration in America because we say that it is. But the 4th of July was celebrated in Ripley. There are photos going back to 1877 that show parades in downtown Ripley on the 4th of July on horseback with wagons. And so it has a long-standing tradition, and it is still a very popular event in the Ripley community. 2 of the more popular 4th of July events that took place here in 1965, the Today Show was invited to Ripley to observe a small-town 4th of July celebration. But technology wasn't such in the day that you could get the instantaneous response. So what the community agreed to do is the community had a mock celebration, and it wasn't the 4th of July, but they acted like it was so that the Today Show could get it on film. And then they drove the film back to New York and showed it back on the 4th of July from the studios in New York. So that was an interesting incident that happened in 1965 with the Today Show. The other interesting thing that happened with the 4th of July in Ripley is the year 2002. It was the first 4th of July after the attacks of 9/11. And President George W. Bush chose Ripley as the place that he would celebrate the first 4th of July after the attacks of 9/11. And President Bush was here. It was quite an event. It was estimated that 10,000 people were on this courthouse square. As you can imagine, security in the area was extremely tight, but that was a special day in a small town of 3,500 people when a standing president of the United States visited on the 4th of July. And the statement that Bush made during his speech was he spent the 4th of July of 2001 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He spent the 4th of July of 2002 in Ripley, West Virginia. The Mountain State Art and Crafts Fair started at the Cedar Lakes Conference Center in 1963. And the original idea was just to have a craft fair to celebrate the arts and crafts of West Virginia and give these people a venue where they could sell their arts and crafts. And that first fair went over so well in 1963 that they decided to have another one the following year. And then it continued to gain momentum, and the Mountain State Art and Craft Fair was really at its peak in the 1960s. And that's when it gained the name of the granddaddy of all art and crafts fairs, because it was the first of its kind in West Virginia. Cedar Lakes was founded in the early 1950s, and it was a state camp for the future farmers of America and the future homemakers of America. That's how Cedar Lakes got its start. So it was the home of the FFA-FHA camp for more than a decade before the Mountain State Art and Craft Fair arrived on the scene. And Cedar Lakes is a year-round operation. They have a craft program there. They have a craft house at Cedar Lakes that offers instruction on various crafts, and it's on a year-round basis. They offer different classes. You can learn everything from quilting to blacksmithing at Cedar Lakes. And Cedar Lakes is going through a transition phase now. It has been owned and operated from its inception by the West Virginia Department of Education, but it is now transitioning into a private enterprise. It will be operated by the Cedar Lakes Foundation. Jackson County was an agricultural County at first, and then in the 1950s you had Kaiser Aluminum come in and dominate the industrial scene for the entire Mid-Ohio Valley. At one time, Kaiser had 5,000 jobs. In the last 30 years, the aluminum industry had difficult times, and Jackson County was hurt by the fact that we were not more diversified with our economy. So there has been a real push over the last 3 or 4 decades to make the economy here more diverse and bring in other industries. For instance, Jackson County is part of the state's Polymer Alliance Zone, and there are several polymer businesses that are located in the Jackson County Industrial Park and Maritime Center. There's a substantial amount of development that is going on that is expected in the Wood County area with the cracker plant, which is going to be a major driver in the West Virginia economy. That plant is going to be located in the southern part of Wood County, and we think there are going to be ramifications for the entire Mid-Ohio Valley, specifically Jackson County. And I think the southern part of Jackson County continues to be a continuation of development from Kanawha County. As more people move out of the Charleston area, we're seeing more and more of these old family farms turned into residential neighborhoods in the southern part of Jackson County. And really, the Ripley CVB celebrates the quality of life in the Jackson County area, the hunting, the fishing, the things that there are to do in the area that a lot of people are not aware of. It's my job as director of the Ripley CVB to spread the word about what there is to do in the Jackson County communities.